now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. I am tired of hearing that. Like, no. It was really all along. Ours was the anti-slavery position. Ours was this higher moral the moral high ground position. No. Something else is behind this.
That is, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only...
Alex is going in! Loving it.
He explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes.
God, this is what Alex is really good at. Ben Shapiro versus Alex O'Connor. Is religion good for society? In the last episode, we reacted to the beginning of this video where Alex and Ben go head-to-head on free will and what the implications are for that. But then they moved into a new section, and now we get to react to this part. Let's see how it goes.
Welcome back to the big conversation from Premiere Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kine. Today, our topic is religion. Is it good or bad for society? And I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. And in the first section, we basically solved the problem of free will. That's done. No one need write on that ever again. So congratulations. That's another credit for you.
Yeah, I think on the delusion point, we terminated in something like, and I know you are, but what am I?
Correct.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And my dad can beat up your dad's. So...
Yeah, that was good. That is kind of what they both concluded about each other's position. But obviously, if you're watching, I want to hear what your thoughts are in the comments.
Let's move on in this section to talking about another easily solved question, morality and its role in society. So, Alex, we started with Ben in the first section. Let's start with you. What for you makes an outcome good or bad? And feel free to break that down, define things as you want. And how do we determine what is good and acceptable in society?
Here is where I may disappoint you and potentially excite Mr. Shapiro in that I don't have a good answer to that question. Okay. In that, obviously, attempts have been made for a long time to ground good outside of God. I must say that similarly to rehash the same theme, I think there are issues with grounding good in God as well. I don't think that removes the problem. I don't quite know what good is, if it indeed exists. I'm quite suspicious of the concept. I think it might be another one of these unfortunately quite nihilistic evolutionary sort of illusions of a sort. I guess I ascribe to emotivism more than anything, which has sort of gone out of fashion in the past decade, but I think still has some truth to it in a sense. It's more of a philosophy of language than it is a philosophy of what good and bad actually is. What I do know, however, is that there are problems, I think, with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect.
Okay, I agree with Alex. I'm curious to learn more about what he's getting at here with good and bad. And I get these are languages, but sometimes there's just shit we know, right, that seem wrong. But they usually, that always comes with like a little salt, because it's like, to who and when and how do we know it's wrong? And then you can justify and find ways to say something isn't wrong. We could get into examples. I'm sure we could find some.
I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And what that means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those inventions and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality.
I've never heard this. I've never watched this, by the way. This is interesting. So morality and the construct of good and evil may have evolved from or come out of religious cultures grounded in gods and such, and therefore may be fictive. I think I'm getting what he's saying.
That recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet. Then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me, because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe.
I don't know if you see what I see. This sounds like a handing over something to Ben, but it isn't really, because if your religion is so delusionally indoctrinating and convincing to you, and it's false, the weaponization of religion can be used for just about anything. That's unfortunate. It could be for good or it could be for bad. And I think what Alex is getting at is ultimately a rational person who, is enlightened, who's learned the way that we have, the way that Alex and I imagine have. We don't need to be invoking a deity to do good or bad. But anyway, I want to see what he has to say. This is getting interesting.
Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates, allegedly, of the creator of the universe is all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
So many things there, and so much that you're saying is quite brilliant. I actually thought you were going in a different direction with that last example, which I'll explain in a second. So to start with the very beginning, obviously the idea of right and wrong. So there are many problems with the motivism. Alistair McIntyre does a good job sort of breaking down the problems with the motivism. But the sort of idea that there have to be certain moral absolutes that are beyond contention, and those moral absolutes have to be universally accepted. You can ground that, I suppose, in a sort of descriptive universe. The problem is that, to go back to your example, which again I think is a really interesting one, if a man comes to kill me, I think the real question of religion versus non-religion in the utility sphere here is it more
in the utility sphere, not if it's true or not, like actually true. Just, does it keep us primates in check?
Likely that a man is going to come to kill you being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you? Or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing is wrong? So if you are faced with these two alternatives, to kind of remove your example one step, the question is why the man has come to kill you. I mean, that's your premise is the man has come to kill you because God told him to, and so he can't be dissuaded by force. Agreed. We see that full scale in the real world on a fairly regular basis. It is also true that over the course of human history, men have come to kill one another on the basis of self-interest in extraordinary amounts of the time. Tribal self-interest particularly, having no particular relationship with God, just the idea that I want to kill
That'd be true.
you over territory. I want to kill you over resources. I want to kill you because you're not a member of my immediate kin family, or because you killed a member of my kin family, and so in revenge, I need to kill a member of your kin family. The entire, to borrow from your language, the entire sort of evolution of religion on a utility basis would have been to create moral absolutes that are applicable more broadly than to you and your friends. Any morality that can be created on an individual level is inherently dangerous because you can immediately graft that morality onto your personal self-interest. The entire purpose of religion, whether you want to ground that in evolutionary brain functionings, or whether you want to ground that in revelation, the entire purpose of religion on a utility level is to remove morality from the purview of my special interest and to say, here are things that I cannot do, even if they are in my interest, because there is a higher power that says I cannot do these things. I think that a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble.
Yeah, now here's the thing. I'm sympathetic to what is being said here by Ben in some way, but I don't like the words like absolutes as if it needs to be a God. Do we honestly think we must need... How condescending is another way of putting it? Do we need to think that humans cannot educate and learn to become smart enough that you don't need to tell them Santa Claus won't give you gifts under the tree if you're a naughty boy? Like, you would think at some point humans would have this common interest and morality that evolved without those absolutes or that religion, because if you just grant, and I think we should for the sake of how critical and obvious it is that Alex's position is, that these religions are false, these gods are not real. If these gods aren't real, think about what Ben is saying. We need to play make-believe in order to keep humans in check. Now, if that's the position you want to take, I guess go for it, but we just need to keep saying, by the way, these gods are fake, till humans can grow out of it and realize. It's like riding your training wheels, and one day you're riding your training wheels, you don't realize your dad snuck and pulled the training wheels off while you're riding your bicycle. You're like, Dad, I'm riding the bicycle. And then you realize, oh my gosh, my training wheels aren't on my bike, but I'm riding the bike fine. You learn how to live being a good person, and you don't need to have the fictitious Santa Claus in order to be a not naughty boy, if that makes sense.
A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances that are universally applicable, it reduces things that we all take for granted, like equal justice before the law, like the idea that the law is supposed to equally apply to everybody, whether they're a member of your family or whether they're not. And there are broad cultural differences in these.
Why can't we anchor those things in absolutes that we have contracted, like a contract as a society have made those absolutes you can't cross, instead of pretending you need to have God? I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. What do you think? Drop in the comments. Tell me your thoughts.
Questions. I mean, to pretend that all human societies have equality under law is obviously not true. It's not even remotely true, actually. There's a very good book called The Weirdest People in the World, all about the idea that we in the West have this sort of ethnocentric view of ourselves where we think everybody thinks like people in the West. But the truth is that because we are Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, we have particular views of the world. Those views are drawn from a particularistic tradition. That particularistic tradition is biblical in nature. I mean, it is Judeo-Christian.
We always come to this historical question, and you really have to ask yourself, really? Is it all biblical in nature? And by the way, the biblical in nature is dependent upon many cultures: Greek, Mesopotamian, Hittite. You can look to the Persians, the Egyptians. I mean, like, Jesus, it's always bibliocentrism. It's always Bible's the primary reason we have morality and all of that. And it just gets old.
Nature, even if you're just describing European society or American society, historically speaking. So the kind of removal of God.
I don't know, man. I'd like to have a historian tell me that. One that is not an apologist, because I think that we started to have a rise in education and coming out of this kind of this dip in what happened in history when we rediscovered and really took serious the ancient thinkers of old, all the philosophers of the great times, the science that was done in the Greco-Roman world, all of that.
God from the equation. Your suggestion is that God makes a person impervious to countervailing responses. And my answer is yes, God does make a person impervious to countervailing responses, including the evils of one's own heart, if you truly believe that God is standing above you, telling you not to do that thing. And again, social science tends to bear this out. People who believe that God is above them tend to give more charity, for example. People who tend to live inside religious communities, within the religious community. And I'm not going to pretend that I think all religions are equivalent in their truth propositions, because I don't. I mean, if I did, I wouldn't be wearing a yarmulke, right? So that's just what it is. Inside religious communities, a lot of social bonds and a lot of social frameworks are built on the basis of this shared belief system. In other words, diversity itself, self-interest, cannot always check self-interest, and it tends to tear apart societies and communities unless there is an orienting goal.
So, okay, real quick, because I know I'm in the middle of his sentence. I keep doing this, but this is important. I remember Darren Brown, the mentalist, we might have to do a reaction to this. He actually did this, he did an actual experiment where he went out of his way and he had these people who had this like ring that they had to go on this thing that would buzz when they touched the I don't know what it was, this like track, and try to get the rings to the end. And if they hit it, they needed to write down how many times. One group, he told them that this chair that's in that room is haunted, that there's a person that stays in that chair. He made it up, but they believed there was a person in the chair. The other group that didn't believe there was a person in the chair did it, and get this, every person, I believe it was every person, I have to go back and watch the show, almost every person in the group that did not get told about this ghost in the chair that's in the same room with them lied about how many times the ring hit to try and self-interest, like what Ben's talking about. The other group that would believe some bullshit actually told the truth. I think almost all of them but one, but I think they all told the truth about how many times the thing buzzed. And there's a sense in which, you know, if God is the thing that's always present, your consciousness, let's say, and it's always watching, and it's the big boogeyman if you do bad, but the blesser if you do good, then you could see how that would work as social pressures keeping people in line, even if it's not true. Then we find ourselves in a weird pickle. If the better world comes from making sure everyone thinks that something's watching, and we could renegotiate the myths of old and find ways to recycle this stuff and say, hey, this is what we're going to craft as our myth, and we're not going to have the dogmas and the nonsense over here, but we do think that something's watching. There needs to be something believable where they actually think it's true so that they behave a certain way. This is the struggle that I'm looking at right now.
That orienting goal traditionally has been performed by church. It's been traditionally performed by the idea that you are serving God together. And because of that, people build these social bonds, including the institutions of police, for example, to prevent people from killing each other, because we now all agree that killing is wrong. So we ought to have a third party that we can actually give the power to stop that killing. So again, I think that the question of utility here is one of whether you think that the chief danger is that people are going to believe in a God who tells them to kill in God's name, or whether you think that the chief danger is in man's own heart, and that man is going to be driven by his own self-interest to commit murder and then call it something else.
I think it's all very well and good when this religious tradition is protecting what you think is good. But as we know, it can do the exact opposite, and it can do so with the same force. Sure. And I suppose the question we have to ask is whether this is a worthwhile trade-off. That is to say, you know, that there may be some social utility in putting our fundamental ethical assumptions outside of the realm of debate. But when those ethical statements begin to inspire what we would probably consider to be less than socially cohesive behavior, there is nothing you can do, nothing to talk people out of them, precisely because that's where they've placed them. And that seems dangerous to me. And it seems, for example,
I like Alex's thinking here. I'm just wondering how it would work out how would you utilize it? How would it operate and function? If we're all negotiating with our ethics that can change instead of making it divine revelation that cannot, or trying to negotiate with ugly shit, which Ben has to do with his Bible, yeah, where does that lead us?
You know, a lot of people talk about how religion can make people happier. It can make people more socially cohesive. It can promote people to start families and have children. This is true of most religions. This is also true of Islam, which I'm not sure you would want to say. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not sure you'd want to say is a force for good in the world. I don't think, in other words, that it's always a worthwhile trade-off. Now,
I agree with you, by the way.
Just because you mentioned the sort of culture of Europe and its success and America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a a recent revival, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually...
he's good too.
Actually, the great... I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about, the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today... I'll expand on this if you like.
Yeah. I mean, this is a good point. That's why I was saying I wish there was a historian that would speak on this, because from what I gather, Christianity was not forward and progressive in terms of many things. And when they claim, a lot of them claim the ethical or moral high ground as if they have something that's radically brand new and nothing before it. Even Bart Ehrman does this sometimes, where he says something as if it's really uniquely new to Christianity, but you find precedent or antecedent in the Greek or Roman world right there at the contemporaneous to the rise of Christianity, and there's other scholars who say this. So it's not like I'm the one saying it. They're academics, and they bring their sources and all of that. So I would say Cattell Berthelot, Jews and the Roman Rivals, is a good book I constantly refer to just to show you the impact and influence on pagan Rome on Jews and Christians, which eventually pagan Rome turned into Christian Rome.
A society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property, now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. I am tired of hearing that. Like, no. It was really all along. Ours was the anti-slavery position. Ours was this higher moral the moral high ground position. No. Something else is behind this.
That is, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only...
Alex is going in. Loving it.
He explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes.
God, this is what Alex is really good at. He's flipping it so hard on them right now. I love this. Alex, we got to record sometime, man.
I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution, which he authored, was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny if it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, so I would buy that, except for the fact that many of the people that you mentioned in these contexts explicitly counted themselves as religious believers.
Yeah, but that's the horse shit. Okay, that's the horse shit. That is what I'm saying. Yeah, at some point along the journey in history, at some point in the future, humans within the tradition buck against the mainstream. All the salmon are swimming downstream, and the one turns around and goes, boom. It's not like you would think, especially if these were true, and if your worldview is true and given by God and what is good, and that what you're claiming is good right now, Ben, is what was done earlier. And at some point in the past, no. Our God has to also work in an evolutionary fashion and slowly, gradually change and find a guy thousands of years later or 1,000, 1,500 years later to make a change and decide to do something different here. Come on. And it's also odd when you find the worldview of polytheists within the Greek world. having so many scientific developments, and Babylon starts astrology and such, but then the Greeks start to capitalize on all of these very amazing scientific renovations, so to speak, in the thought of mankind. But then you got to wait another 1,000, 1,200 years before Christians start doing stuff like that. But also when you start seeing Muslims start doing stuff like that in the Golden Age, and they're just revitalizing the ancient Greek work. Anyway, sorry, I get on a little tangent here because we've all heard this before.
And we're speaking in the name of the religion while they're doing it. So to take the abolitionist movement as an example, I mean, William Wilberforce, obviously a tremendously religious person and a big believer in the New Testament.
That don't mean nothing.
Obviously deeply ensconced in the New Testament, right? Yeah, certainly important to the scientific revolution. The point about religion, and this is why when I wrote my book, what I have to name the title now and plug myself because that's the way it works. The right side of history. But the reason that I talked about how reason and moral purpose made the West is because I think that one of the fundamental precepts of at least Judeo-Christian religion is that when God gives a text or a set of ideas to human beings, he expects us to use our reason to apply to those texts. And so the sort of evolution of interpretation is part of the religious tradition. I mean, that's always been the case in my religion anyway. So I always hesitate to speak on behalf of other people's religions because I don't know them nearly as well as I know my own. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about sort of the application of reason to tradition in the religious tradition, obviously we have books and books and books of texts discussing and debating these very ideas. And the idea of religious debate has always been central to the idea of Judeo-Christian religion. And when it hasn't been, it's been seen as repressive and has spawned then other Christian movements that then argue with the original movement and end up generating in almost Hegelian fashion some new form of interpretation. The point that I'm making is that outside that framework, it doesn't exist, meaning that once if the argument is over interpretation of particular biblical verses in a context in which there is a God who puts certain moral precepts beyond human judgment, those arguments you can have without threatening the entire social structure. What is very difficult is to have a social structure at all in the absence of fundamental moral precepts that are presupposed by everyone. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing a sort of revival of this idea that religion is very important to the West is because one of the things that we have seen is that as religion has become less important to the West, we've seen declining birth rates en masse. We've seen rises in suicidal ideation. We've seen, especially over the last 10 years, tremendous individual atomization, certainly an extraordinary amount of less social connection, right? All of these things are things that, frankly, used to be provided by church and these social institutions that, again, were oriented toward a single purpose. So when you talk about the idea that I'm going to put aside the free will discussion because I think, again, it's easy to get caught up in the reversion to the argument that I was making before when you were saying that, can you argue the man out of stabbing you? To use your framework, I mean, you can't argue him out of doing anything. I mean,
so he's not. He's straw manning. As you saw in the last episode, Alex would see this as a straw man because you can reason with people, but clearly what happens ultimately becomes that deterministic thing. So no, there are times when you can communicate and people can be reasoned out of stuff. He's ultimately talking about the dogma and the extremist view that someone has driven by this divine revelation. They must kill you. I mean, that's really it. And I feel like Ben's strawmanning Alex here.
You're going to say words. The words are going to have an impact. But you can't argue him out of doing anything. But not to get back into a topic that we've handled. Free will is done.
I'm not going to answer that. Although hopefully people will know from what I said before that I think it's still sensible to say you can argue somebody out or something.
You strawman.
The first half of what you say there is in so many words, I think, what I was saying before, which is that, yes, this goes both ways. That is, thanks be to God when he is able to provide us with the grounding for resisting oppression and throwing off tyranny. Yeah. But what about when the same God is used to justify the exact opposite? All I'm saying is that this goes both ways. We'll never know.
You're going to have to weigh in one side or the other, meaning that in terms of utility. Right, you're building a society. Let's say that I won't say you're God. Let's say that you are master of a society and you get to build that society. One of the things that presumably you are going to do is you're going to build in certain things that are untouchable. Right, there's going to be certain moral precepts that you're going to build in that are.
You're already failing here, in my opinion, because I can already imagine Alex creating a world or a society that isn't going to have murder or disease or any of that kind of stuff. So you're just taking it a level above to going, remember now, there's supposedly a creator here.
Untouchable. And
now, if we're talking about just humans creating a society and they're making something untouchable, then that's different, because death and murder and all that and the behaviors of humans is kind of out of our hands. So we have to find ways to negotiate and make that something where people act a certain way.
are you going to justify those things to people such that they are going to believe you? You're going to either have to use compulsion, or you're going to have to use some sort of other argument that is so strong that they are going to overweigh their self. I mean, there's a reason why Voltaire suggested he didn't believe in God, but he hoped that his maid did, so she wouldn't steal the silverware.
Yeah, that's an interesting indictment on the position that theists don't say that atheists can't be moral, right? When people have this argument about morality,
atheists can certainly be moral.
Well, oftentimes people have this misunderstanding of the argument. Christopher Hitchens did it best in saying, we don't need divine permission to be good and all of this. Fine, but as you say, you don't need to believe in God to be good, but you need to believe in God to ground that goodness. But then when you sort of casually throw in this statement by Voltaire, I don't believe in God, but I hope that my maid does. That implies that actually maybe you do think that without the belief in God, somebody isn't going to.
No, I think that Voltaire thought that he was good, meaning that Voltaire was an atheist and thought that he was good. But his point was sort of back to the Straussian Platonic point.
His point was that he hoped his maid believed in God because without that belief, she wouldn't be able to act morally.
Right. So because again, when we're arguing on the basis of broad societal utility, one of the things, so I happen to be in the happy position of being able to argue that what I think is socially useful also happens to be true. Mm-hmm. The question I'm asking you, and I think that...
So what ultimately could be, Alex sitting across from Ben could be like, hey, I think it's socially useful. I don't think it's true.
It's what a lot of this conversation is.
And I think he does to some extent. I do too. That's because I think religion is something we've evolved and developed over, time.
Whether you think that what is socially useful is actually false or an evolutionary illusion. And I think that's kind of the position that you're taking, unless you want to argue that, generally speaking, religion is either not evolutionarily adaptive, which would be a hard position to actually take.
Well, I think it must be, otherwise it wouldn't exist.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was hinting at before.
Or you'd have to argue that it's, even if it's adaptive, it's of no general benefit to humankind or is an illusion, right? Yes. I mean, that's the position that you're taking. So one of the things that I'm enjoying about the conversation is that I don't think either of us are going to argue each other in anything, but it is clarifying what exactly the lines of the division are.
Yes, to backtrack a moment, because you said more than one thing in what I just responded to. You also mentioned, while you talked about Isaac Newton being a Christian, I mean, people were astonished discovering his private notes to find that he spent more time talking about theology than he did science. This is certainly the case, but I do think it's worth pointing out when people like to notice that the originators of the scientific revolution in particular were believers in God. There are a few things to say on that. First, we don't know what Galileo thought in his heart of hearts, and part of the reason for that is because despite tripping over himself to say, now look, I don't think Scripture is wrong. Now look, I believe in God and I am a Christian and I believe in Scripture, but maybe the Earth orbits the sun, his life falls apart. So suppose he did secretly have doubts about the existence of God. Do you think we'd ever have even found out about it?
And that's an unfalsifiable argument.
I think not a chance. In other words,
but the lack of falsifiability makes it difficult for making a counter argument.
But even if it is unfalsifiable, there's many people in the world you have to imagine that have done this.
In other words, let's not be so confident.
Maybe he did have a secret diary, but I have no proof that he had a secret diary.
What I'm saying is let's not be so confident about this. The second thing to say is that these men, if that's what they were remembered for, that is their theology, then they wouldn't be remembered. Thirdly, is that just on the minor point that people often like to point out that, well, the originators of the scientific revolution were religious, and so science can't conflict with religion. I'm not going to make the claim that science does conflict with religion in principle, but supposing that it did, this would not serve as a rebuttal, because if it were the case that the scientific revolution and the scientific method undermines religion, then of course the people who invented the scientific method would themselves have been religious, because they hadn't invented the mechanism by which it came to be undermined yet.
Yeah, but then afterward they presumably would be irreligious or a-religious, which is what happened to Darwin, for example.
It doesn't happen that quickly, right? It really doesn't happen.
On an individual level, it certainly happens.
If we're talking about the development of the scientific method, we're not talking about the kind of thing that just happens in a lifetime. I mean, to attribute it to Galileo and Newton as we happily do is far too simplistic. This is something that happens over at least decades.
Right, but you're making both an individual argument and a broader historical argument. So pick one.
And so what I'm saying is that the individual beliefs of the founders of that revolution, I don't think that revolution would have gotten off the ground enough from just their contributions within their lifetime to shake decades of prior faith. However, when you get to someone like a Darwin, then we start to see agnosticism. Then we start to see people having their doubts. And then when you get into the modern era, atheism abounds. And so,
Yeah, so Alex's point, and Ben doesn't like it, is that gradually you're going to find, as the tools and the science and the observations of the world start to come out, to seem to point way in a direction that isn't so theistic as it was once thought. Yeah, the people who came up with the initial tools to figure this stuff out may not have all doubted. Some might have, and we just have no evidence that they did or didn't. Doesn't matter. You can't use the argument, Ben says. Darwin started doubting. Got it. Many people have developed from that over time and started doubting. And the funny thing is, I've watched people in clear evidence in their face about the Bible that are more progressive. They realize the Bible teaches some horrific stuff. They say that, and they still want to negotiate the faith and still want to negotiate somehow continuing the tradition, even believing in some way. And I think to myself, damn, even when the evidence seems to be overwhelming that this is very human and not divine at all, they're still looking for divine in it, it seems.
So in other words, if it were the case that this thesis, which, like I say, is not something that I'm defending here, I'm just sort of rebutting the rebuttal to it. That is, if it were the case that the scientific method were this king of undermining religion, then I think we would expect the fact that those who invented it to have been religious. It would be like saying, isn't it amazing that the person who invented the motor car didn't own a motor car before that?
Well, no, because, again, you've now also made the case that perhaps they had secret diaries, or in their heart of hearts, they weren't actually...
He's using an analogy to point out maybe one of them did doubt, and you think if they can't tell you the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, that they're not going to also have their head cut off when they're shown tools of torture? I mean, no way he's going to say, I don't believe in God anymore.
Religious or convinced away from that. So again, that's why I'm saying I feel like you're making a broader historical argument that works, and I think you're making an individual argument that doesn't quite.
I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying that we would never know why is that? Why will we never know what Galileo really thought about religion?
Well, I'm going to just accuse you of assuming facts, not in evidence. I mean, like,
let's move it away from
because
Galileo.
again,
why are you getting so butthurt and not able to engage the potential point Alex is simply trying to make?
Yeah, like I don't want to get into the mind of Galileo, nor do I care very much. But the reality is that many of the people who were the progenitors of the scientific revolution and participants in the scientific revolution specifically were searching for something higher because they thought that was their godly duty to do so. I mean, this has been true since the time of Roger Bacon. I mean, the idea that you have people who are specifically seeking out the nature of the universe because there's an understandable...
Dude, I spent 15 years seeking the truth of the Bible, the truth of Christianity, and found in the end how human it is. The very thing that drove me to discover what I believed was the truth and to really get the understanding led me out of the very thing I thought was the truest and should never be doubted. Come on, Ben.
Again, another religious precept. There's an understandable universe that God has created, and your mind is a reflection of certain truths that are in that universe. These are all non-materialist atheistic concepts. That was the basis for virtually all of science, including the origins of the scientific revolution. Now, you can make the argument very easily. I mean, I make it all the time because I have to metaphoricalize the beginning of Genesis, for example, that the words of Genesis don't jibe with the words of science when it comes to the age of the universe, for example. And obviously that's true, which is why both Maimonides and Aquinas are talking about in the Middle Ages, the idea that if science comes into conflict with religion, you're either getting one of them wrong or you're getting both of them wrong. And so the constant sort of reinterpretation of religion in light of the facts that are established by the scientific method, I don't think that that's a rebuttal of religion. And so and more than that, I think that yeah,
but you're using this idea that their belief in God and their belief in higher things is what led them to these discoveries about science. And it's like, yeah, but my belief in God led me further and deeper into discoveries which actually undermined the very thing I thought I was on an adventure to prove true and even know better of. And so I don't get how these scientific minds who could be searching, journeying, and led and inspired by the divine in their minds, that system, whether they themselves did it or the generations after, utilized the same tools and went, these are blind spots that they just didn't see. And we're now seeing.
The peculiar idea that religion itself must fundamentally be undermined by scientific discovery, I don't see quite why.
Well,
Well, there's a lot of good reasons why, but you just have a tradition that's willing to bend words like rubber bands and do whatever you can to keep the tradition alive.
I would agree with that. I'm just saying that the rebuttal that's presented to that opinion fairly commonly, I don't think works for the reasons that I've said.
Okay, well, let's give you both a little breather, because we're going to go to another break very shortly. We fitted in so much, and I had all these questions, and I haven't asked any of them, and I'm worried now that I'm going to be left unemployed.
Before we move on, I don't know if I can have one final word on this Galileo point, because I know it seems quite strange that I'm sort of hypothesizing in this way, but you said, look, when religion and science come into conflict, either one is wrong or both is wrong. Galileo was wrong about one of these things potentially. What happens if I mean, you can? It's great talking about the utility of his religious belief in inspiring his scientific endeavor, but what happens when the immediate fruit of that is him discovering something which should have been a celebrated idea and instead was suppressed, and he ends up under house arrest in Tuscany for the rest of his life? Why? Specifically because the religious authorities, in their sentencing of Galileo, did not just say that he failed to prove it, did not just say that he was, being a bit of an a-hole in his approach to the thing, but said specifically because it is false, absurd, and contrary to Scripture. That is why that scientific position was suppressed on specifically religious motivations.
And far be it for me to defend the Catholic Church and its crackdown.
Yeah, Ben's okay with those Catholics making a huge blunder.
Okay,
you've come to the wrong place for that.
Okay, it's time. It's time for another break.
Okay, what did you think of that? That was fun. Look, the next, I believe, section, we covered some of it. I feel like we just need to rehash this thing in our next review of this particular discussion between Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. I think Alex gets the better hand. Ben does a good job, but not good enough. That's my opinion. Tell me yours in the comment section. Be sure to subscribe. Check that bell. YouTube will notify you every time we react. The sooner you get here, the sooner you drop a comment, the sooner you like the video, you share it. It will help this channel grow. Please help us grow. Let YouTube see us. And if you're dropping comments, it helps the engagement, and YouTube will recommend this to more people so you can have fun with them in the comment section. Seriously, thank you, everybody. Until next time, see you then.